Greetings, everyone. Now we're going to talk capitalism. I would like to begin by giving you just a solid definition of what that is. Capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So that is what the United States is becoming at this point. And to think about this, workers as a class of people, the working class, and they're selling their labor. They compete with other workers to get jobs that are available, and workers, although they share similar interests, all want higher wages, good treatment, benefits, and they will still compete whenever there is never 100% employment. And there never is. And that's really the big lesson that we learned from the readings this week, especially with Marullo. As you'll see, it's just one of these things where it's really hard to form alliances based on class as you have a lot of differences in terms of race and ethnicity too. So let's think about the general industrial outlook from the 1830s to the 1860s. The Trans-Appalachian West and colonists and farmers now chose to buy their cloths, shoes, and other goods from factories that are predominantly in the Northeast. So the U.S. expansion into the West always relied on the industrial and capital production of the Northeast, which in turn also relied on the slave economy of the South. So everything's sort of codependent, and this capitalist society is building on this network, right, of labor in the South in terms of slavery, and then you have these factories in the Northeast and the West, which is needing more and more goods. The U.S. government always supported the growth and expansion of capitalism. The growth of railroads and the building of roads and canals are the best and easiest examples of this. And also, iron production at this point is skyrocketing in the 1840s, especially. Many types of work maintain the status of skilled profession, which means like iron workers, and many aspects of the work was not overtaken by mechanization. And while it expanded in size and amount, it was carried out as it had traditionally been done, which required a massive amount of specialized knowledge and skills on the parts of workers. In other types of work, however, things became rationalized. This was change of time in industrial and capitalist and urban economy. Clock discipline, it was looking at who was in charge and really depersonalized a lot of this labor, on the other hand. The rationalization of labor took place in many industries involving raw materials. The milling of flour, sawing lumber, butchering pigs. No longer would a single butcher take one pig that he purchased or owned and slaughter it. It was now in an assembly line of pigs, right? And this created more lower paid workers that were either semi-skilled or unskilled, as you would just be in a larger factory and things were kind of more mass produced. So unions would constantly fight over how to organize. Would you include all workers or just the skilled workers? Could you unionize the unskilled workers that worked in the butcher factories or not? So this is also one of the first questions we have in terms of creating a labor. In addition to this, we have the boom and bust of the economy. This represents another inherent feature of capitalism, which is the boom and bust cycle. I'm sure you guys have heard of the boom and bust cycle. Economists often try to refer to these as part of a natural business cycle. As profits rise and production increases, investment also expands. But eventually a tipping point is reached and sometimes referred to as a bubble nowadays. This is when there is too much investment in one or more areas of the economy, kind of like what happened in housing recently. And during a boom, there's too much production for the amount of demand, too many goods for the amount of people buying them. This causes wages and prices to fall and leads to lower production value and worker layoffs. Values in land and stocks usually collapses, leading the economy into a recession or depression. For example, Sidney Fisher described Philadelphia in 1842. He said, "The streets seemed deserted. The largest merchant houses are shut up and to rent. There is no business, no money, no confidence." So the effects of this on workers. Ideologically, the cycle should give workers more reason to organize and try to gain more control over the economy. Workers lose their jobs during a bust, and while the employer and investor absorbs the losses as part of the upper class. If workers were to organize, then they could control production levels, costs, investments, and etc. in theory, right? But workers, mostly American workers, have rarely, if ever, tried to seize any large amount of control over the economy. Instead, busts make it nearly impossible for workers to organize in the long term. Workers are laid off, and now your union is half the size, and you're just happy to have a job, so you're not going to rock the boat anymore. This is what makes unionization really difficult. Unions before the Civil War tended to be small, local, and flourished in the skilled trades of shoemakers, tailoring, woodworking, and printing. They tended to fade whenever a panic or recession hit the market, and they remained divided along ethnic, racial, religious, and gendered lines. The Civil War and the domestic economy, the role of the government in boosting this economy was really important. The nation passed its first income tax, and the government pumped unprecedented sums into the economy to boost production during the Civil War. In 1863, a merchant's magazine recalled, quote unquote, "Seldom, if ever, has the business of Massachusetts been more active or profitable. In every department of labor, the government has been indirectly or directly the chief employer and paymaster." So this governmental help was really doing wonders for the economy. Many merchants and capitalists got rich off the war. Cotton mills made record profits as they reduced their output. Brokerage houses made unheard amount of commissions, and railroads got a huge percentage, with two corporations gaining about 20 million acres of free land and $60 million in government bonds. So this entirely changed the American character. The New York Herald wrote, "The individual who makes the most money, no matter how, and spends the most, no matter for what, is considered the greatest man." This is really beginning our understanding of capitalism at its height, right? Manufacturers began forming associations to cooperate and pool information. This allowed them to use immigrant labor to replace striking workers, as you can see in Marollo. We read about this too. Or to invest in labor-saving machines. So this put workers out of a job, right? If you industrialize your labor and you need less workers. It also gave manufacturers even more leverage to force workers to sign these yellow dog contracts, where a worker would be made to promise that they wouldn't join a union. Workers themselves suffered, meanwhile. Although work was plentiful, inflation ate up most of their paycheck. Between 1860 and 1864, consumer prices rose 72%, while raises only rose 42%. Some formed unions and did strikes, but they generally could not compete with the wartime economy. Some 13 skilled occupational groups, like tailors, coal miners, and railway engineers, formed national unions as the number of yearly strikes rose each year. But still, the conditions weren't great, and some blamed slavery while others scapegoated the free blacks working in their area, who would often work for wages lower than white men. The pressure and conditions of the war also led to draft riots. Class inequality was again evident in this facet. The draft became law in 1863, coinciding with a shift toward acceptance and public avowals that slavery was the cause of the war. Finally, people were admitting it. And a draftee could stay at home even if drafted as long as he provided a substitute in his place, who he would pay, or if he paid a $300 commutation fee. The commutation fee ended in late 1864, so you couldn't pay out your way out of the war at that point. Draft riots also occurred in New Jersey, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Wisconsin, and New York. The urban poor and immigrant groups were largely against the draft and viewed the war as a boon to the rich and powerful. So it was seen again to be making the rich richer and also more powerful, but really employing the use of a lot of immigrant and poor labor, as those who could afford to pay a substitute would do so, or those who could afford to pay that $300 so they wouldn't have to go to war could do so. They were also usually Democrats that were the ones in power at this time. They viewed the war also as helping black people over themselves. So these white Democrats really feared a potential influx of black labor that would be cheaper than hiring northern urban whites. For example, in 1863, when a strike by a white longshoreman was broken by bringing in black workers, whom the longshoremen called scabs, that's a term you'll see in the reading a lot, the issue of race, gender, and economy all blended together. So here's another just basic kind of lecture onto capitalism at this time and how the industrialization of America is really playing into a lot of these divisions and why unionization is really difficult at this time and also in our current place. So thank you so much, and we'll talk more soon.